too.
Oh, I didn't put those answers up there. There were three
Oh, okay.
survey questions. I skipped talking about the first two. Question number 3 was that. This, where do I point this?
You gotta just look at me,
Oh.
because now it's on my machine.
Thank you, sorry. All right.
I should probably
Will you
put my
go
glasses
ahead?
on.
Oh, okay.
Ready to go?
Yes, well, I kind of already read these out loud to everybody,
Do we need
so,
to follow him and make sure he's okay?
pardon?
Never mind, sorry.
So, I just didn't hear, sorry, what'd you say?
I asked if we needed to follow Brian, he just ran out. Make sure he was okay.
Oh, okay.
Thanks, Steve.
All right,
You looked
and
upset.
will you go on, please? I kind of read these out loud already. Oh, thanks, and. Okay, so have any of you read from this book yet, Good Thinking, that Doug has talked about? Okay, so he's talking about having you read from it next year. So here's a quote from it. And it really summarizes the whole point of the book. So the author, Eric Commer, says, how well do students think? We test recall and application of facts all the time, but those are only 2 aspects of thinking. How well do students apply analytical or argumentative or logical thinking? So these kind of things were reflected in more of the details that you gave in the survey too. How effectively do they analyze information presented in diverse media? Can they critically analyze a speaker's point and point of view? How well do they construct an argument? These tasks all require reasoning rather than remembering. When we look closely at our students, we notice that their reasoning skills are not what they need to be. That last part, oops. Cue slide, please. Oh, thank you, sorry. Okay, oops. Well, that very last part that was just highlighted there was that emphasis on the skills that we're looking for with students are the reasoning skills. And Eric Commer says what those involve or the thinking skills, which involve reasoning rather than remembering. I want you to latch on to that statement, and we're going to reflect on it later on at the end of the day.
Am I hitting
Do you
again?
mind? Yeah. And again. Oops, it went too, that's okay. So, the picture up there a moment ago was St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the best thinkers, also one of the best people known for memory and ability to remember. Did you know stories about him? So he wrote the Summa Theologica, or Theologia, I don't know which one it is, I've heard both recently, I have to look it up. Does anybody know?
Judd.
Okay, thank you. All right, so Summa Theologia, that, and supposedly, anybody correct me if I'm wrong, I've heard the story that he could have 4 different chapters in his mind at a time, be dictating them to 4 different scribes. So he'd dictate part to this one, who would be writing it, while he dictated to this one, who would be writing it, and so on. So his ability to remember was quite impressive. That ability to remember allowed him to think very clearly. So remembering and thinking are closely tied rather than separate things. So in order to kind of address that today, I'm going to first talk about a little theory. How do we learn about the world? How do we learn about language? One more slide, please. Yes, thanks. And how do we learn language? So it's about the world, about language, and then actually learning language. You will see how all of this is related to your own personal teaching as we go on throughout the day. For now, just take a step back and think about, I hope you'll enjoy learning about these things. Oops. Could you please go ahead? Thanks.
One more.
Yes, please. There's so much here. Why don't I just stand at the back and talk for a moment?
Can you
while-
just take your laptop up there?
Well, it's not charged, so no, she can't.
Actually, you know what? I'm going to draw this down on the board as we go, and then I'll just have you fill in all the.
Caitlin?
Yeah.
Your little clicker might work if you pointed at Kathy's.
It's not hooked
Or I
up to my
can just-
computer, Rod.
Okay. All right. So, Kathy, I'm just going to keep. Sorry, you have tons of little clicks to do. But if you look at this picture of St. Thomas Aquinas, please notice first just the picture. The characteristics of this picture, if he is learning to, or he is reading, he's taking in the information, he's processing, he's thinking, there are three main components of this picture that I'll be referring to a bunch today. What's this thing at the bottom here? Yep, the text. What's this thing right here?
A mouth.
His mouth, from which spoken language comes. So this refers to spoken language. And then his head is where he's holding the mental representations of what he's reading. As we read, we make a picture in our mind. Maybe it's a more literal picture like a movie if we're reading a narrative, or it's more of some kind of structured graphic organizer if we're just relating what abstract information we're reading about to previous knowledge, that kind of thing. Did you follow that? All right, so.
Laura's gonna click it as soon as she stops walking.
Oh, awesome, thanks. Okay. All right, so written symbols at the bottom. Spoken language in the middle, and mental representations at the top. The three main components of literacy.
Okay, just because I don't wanna make it easier for you, click down in this corner. It seems to be a corner or something.
Okay, all right, thanks. Hold on a second. Okay. I'm just gonna fast forward through these things for the moment. I wanna get us back on track. We'll be covering that again later. Okay, so learning about the world. When we're born, actually before we're born, when we're in the womb, we're taking in information about the world. Did you know that babies, when they are as young as 3 days, which is about as early as we can test them, people have pushed it a little bit before that now, but babies can recognize their own mother's voice, distinguish their mother's voice from other voices, and they can distinguish the language that they've been hearing while they're in the womb from other languages. So that's fascinating to me. They've been listening and they can pick up patterns already, even when they're first born, as young as we can test them. So even from then, even from the womb, they've been viewing, noticing and observing. They can't really see, of course, before they come out, but then they can. Look, smell, they observe sounds, tastes, feels. These are the things that make up the mental representations. On that picture of St. Thomas Aquinas, where was the mental representations bubble? At his head. Yes, way up there at the top. All right. So here's a specific image that we might observe. It could be our very own mother. It's a picture of Mother Mary. The more often we see it, we make a category. We know that we've seen this image many times, and we have associations with it that are related to what we've seen, what we've heard, what we've smelled, what we've tasted, especially as a baby, and what we've touched. So the mental representation of the mother, in this case the very specific mother of each baby, is loaded with memories of the mother's, of the sensory observations that this child made about their mother. Does this make sense? So that's a very easy one to imagine. But we do a similar thing with every other object that we observe in the world. And so we make all these little folders full of the sensory experiences that we've had related to those objects. That's how we begin to form memory. So memory is our little filing system. We label the files with names of things as we learn language. Oh, so this is learning all those other things. We make connections between them. We make connections between seeing the mom and the dog and the dad sitting in the chair, looking out the window, and so on. Okay, so we learn about the world by making sensory observations, which we use to make those mental representations, that blue bubble at the top. Then we make connections between all those mental representations, and we'll come back to that more later. Have you followed that so far? Do you think you could describe it to somebody else? How do we learn about the world? Can anybody give a summary?
We gather censored input from all of our 5 senses.
Yeah.
And just want to put it in a folder.
Beautiful. Okay, and you use the word input, which is where I was going with this. So we take all the input to then later on be able to create output ourselves. So the output that we create in this case is linguistic, language related. So we'll come to that more later. So now the connections between spoken language and mental representations. This is a little bit long. So one specific way that we create mental representations then is by listening to the world around us. We hear all kinds of sounds. Here's all kinds of environmental sounds that we hear. Birds, faucets, whistles, sneezes and nose blowing, bells. We also hear spoken language. And we process those differently. So we process environmental sounds different from speech and language. So the speech and language is specific to humans, and it is distinct. We begin to connect the spoken language representations that we make with those pictures, those folders of items in the world. So speech is continuous. It doesn't have pauses between words. But as infants are listening to speech, they begin to notice the patterns in what they're hearing, and that's what allows them to understand when one word ends and another word begins. They realize that they hear mama many times in the middle of other words, and so they begin to pick out mama or mommy or mom or something like that. And then they can recognize that the things around it are different. And they gradually just learn to parse that spoken language into parts that might sound like separate words to you now. They might sound like they have pauses in between, but there's no pauses there. There aren't any pauses there. This is why foreign languages sound so like they're being spoken so fast, because when you're not familiar with the language, you don't understand the structure in it. So it sounds like it's just this long, unbroken thing, which is how a native language sounds to infants when they're beginning to learn. And they gradually just learn to pick out the parts. Does that make sense? So the ability to do that depends very much, the ability to break the spoken language down into its individual words, learn vocabulary, connect them to our mental representations, depends very much on how much language we hear. Has anybody heard of the Hart and Risley study that's at the bottom there? In the last 10 years or so, it's been a lot more commonly cited, like just in the news or online and various things. So you might have heard of it. It's often referred to as the 30 million word gap study. Does that ring a bell? A couple people. I'll explain it briefly in a moment. I kind of already talked about this. So we make connections between those spoken language patterns that we're hearing. This looks a little bit different on this screen than it did on my computer. That's all right. And the spoken language. Make those connections. Oops, don't want to go there yet. Okay. So Hart and Risley. Sorry, a little bit quiet here. Okay, I'm going to just list these on the board for you. I don't have the presenter tools, so, all right. What was in the bottom bubble in that picture? Picture St. Thomas Aquinas here and the components of that picture.
Written symbols.
Thank you. Written symbols, that's the text. What was in the middle bubble?
Spoken language.
Great, represented by the mouth. And what was in the top bubble?
Mental representations.
Great. We're going to talk more about the spoken language bubble right now, kind of expand it. It's composed of, I'm going to put these in alphabetical order, a hierarchical structure of language. So if we take these 4 different levels of language, try and just imagine what they are for a moment, and then in your mind or on paper in front of you, can you put them in order from the smallest level of language to the largest level of language? It says clauses, discourse, phrases, words. Clauses, discourse, phrases, words. Don't worry if you're not even quite sure what the distinction is between some of those. We'll talk about it to the level that matters.
Words would be the smallest.
Yes, words would be the smallest,
Phrases.
and what would be the next?
Phrases.
Yes, and then,
Clauses.
yes, and then,
Discourse.
yes. We'll define discourse in a little bit, but it's connected language, so you have to have more than one sentence in order to have discourse. A clause can be the independent clause or the dependent clause. The independent clause is what a sentence is. And then a phrase could be like a prepositional phrase at the desk, or a noun phrase, a verb phrase, an adjective phrase. And a word is just a single word. You only need one word to make up a phrase. Go! Somebody shouts that to somebody else as they're running around a track. It's a single word, it's a phrase, it's a clause, it's not discourse, because we need to have multiple clauses in order to have discourse. Does that make sense? If the runner running around the track answered, then it would be discourse. Clear? Okay. Oops, left here. So here is what I just said to you. Why are two clauses circled rather than only one like down here?
Because then you have discourse.
Yes, because you have to have two clauses to make discourse, whereas you only need one of all the others to make the top one. All right, or to make the one above it. Why do you think there's a heart around word?
Can't do anything without it.
Say that again?
Can't do anything without it.
Can't do anything without it. It's the heart of everything, the individual word. You know, I think God calls us to our vocations and allows us to see Him particularly through whatever vocation He has called us to. And I realized, I think for myself, how much I believe that as I learned more and more about language, and it really helped me appreciate the grandeur of God and how amazing He is. The fact that we learn language is completely and utterly amazing. And I loved, as I studied this more and more and realized how central the word is, one day at Mass, the reading was the beginning of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word. And everything is based on the Word. And there's a lot more detailed things about that we can talk about. We might if we have time at the end of the day. But really studying language and thinking about it can allow you to have greater insight into God and into our relationship with Him. And I think He designed it that way. And for some of us, that's what He uses. He uses nature that way with me too, and with some people that's the primary way, but it's kind of a good way to get to know Him more. I just wanted to mention at the bottom here, morphemes. Does anybody know what morphemes are? They're the smallest meaningful units of language. So those are the suffixes, the prefixes, the roots, the parts of words that have meaning. And so those are pretty central also. Worth mentioning, we aren't going to dwell on that today. We are focusing on above the word level. Mostly because that's what's most relevant across all disciplines. So this is, if we meet in smaller discipline-specific groups, then we can talk about discipline-specific morpheme usefulness. All right, going to skip this for a moment also. All right. I'm going to give you your first handout. You're going to use this several times throughout the day today, so just follow my directions for what you do with it. Would you mind taking one and passing it on? Oh, thank you. And I'll start over here.
Little handout.
Yep, welcome.
If I could take it, yeah, perfect, fine.
that you can see one of the images at a time, so that the colored parts are on the outside.
I am giving away someone else's pencils right now, so now would be the time to take one. I know we're supposed to.
Yeah, that's true.
Do we get marked down if we use a pen, Michelle?
You do not get marked down if you use a pen. I'm
I'm
not doing any reading, hallelujah.
Doug, there's no printing. Okay, there it is.
All right, so would you use that picture at the moment to try and recall, just write in for yourself, the words inside the bubbles that we've already talked about a few times? Okay, so I think you know them. Bottom was what again?
Written symbols,
And the middle,
spoken language,
and top?
mental representation.
Thank you. Mr. Murphy mentioned input. As we go up this model of language acquisition, this side represents us receiving input, the other side represents us producing output. So if we look at written symbols and we take them in, we look at a book, we observe it, we perceive it, we recognize patterns in it, then what we are doing is decoding. Sounding out, recognizing words, getting the words off the page, whatever kind of phrase you want to think about there. The next step, once we've done that, we basically, by doing that, we've turned the written symbols into spoken language. Even if we haven't spoken them out loud, we've activated the speech processing part of our brain. So we have, in a sense, to our brains, we have spoken. That's for skilled readers. Readers who aren't as skilled don't necessarily activate that part of their brain nearly as much, but we want to try to get them to. So the first part of this process that St. Thomas Aquinas was doing was looking at symbols, decoding them to change them into spoken language, even if you don't say it out loud. And then in order to understand what he's doing the same process. If you look on your colored thing in front of you right now, what part of St. Thomas is right over here?
So,
His ear.
His ear, yes. His ear. What do we do with our ear? Listen. So this part of the process is what we do when we are comprehending what we listen to. Listening comprehension. So when we read, there's basically two main steps. One, getting the words off the page by decoding, and two, activating the exact same processes we use when we're listening. So if a person is good at listening, then they're going to be good at this second part of the reading process. If they are a poor listener, they're going to have trouble processing the written text to their maximum capacity. They may be able to do it better than they can when they're listening. Why? Because when we listen, as soon as I'm done talking, the words are done. You can maybe retain them in your memory for a moment, but then they're gone. But when you're reading, if you have trouble comprehending, what can you do? Yeah, go back, reread, because the text is right there in front of you. Speech is fleeting, but the text is right there, it's concrete, right in front of you, you're able to look at it again. So that kind of provides extra support for people who maybe couldn't do this as well. That's where reading strategies come in. Have you learned about reading strategies in general? Have any of you read the other book that you mentioned to me, Doug? Okay, so have you talked about reading, or are you aware of reading strategies? I know some people would be from probably your college classes. What are some reading strategies you're familiar with? Talk to the text, great. What others?
That's cute, 3 R's right there.
Okay, great. Survey, question, read, recite, review. If these aren't familiar to you, that's okay. We'll talk about what's relevant later. But how about monitoring your own comprehension? Does these ring a bell? Do you really not know these, or are you just being quiet? Yes, okay, these aren't familiar.
No. I was been doing a lot with having the kids write, doodle. That's the
Yes.
talking text part,
Yes,
thought bubbles.
yes.
Actually, just have them do everything we taught students not to do 20 years ago. Like mark it all up.
Yes, yeah. In order to help them analyze it as they go, keep track of it, make sure that they've actually read it is a lot of the point of that.
Yeah.
You can't skip over it if you have to do something with it. So some of the very typical reading comprehension strategies, that's really not the point of what we're doing right now, but I want you to just get a sense of it. So listening comprehension involves being able to visualize in your head what you're hearing. So if you're listening to a story, if you're listening to Goldilocks and the Three Bears, you're going to be able to retain that story a lot more easily if you know what bears are. And if you can imagine a woods and a house. If you don't know what those things are, it's going to be hard. That's a very simplistic example, but you can imagine transferring that to whatever topic you're trying to teach. It's going to be a lot easier for students to listen and visualize, read and visualize, if they're familiar with the individual components that they're reading about, right? So visualizing allows a person then to monitor their own comprehension. So as they read along, to be able to, if some new text comes up that doesn't jive with the picture in their mind, they're going to notice if they have a picture in their mind. But if they're not forming any picture in their mind as they go, something that doesn't quite fit could easily go right past them. All right, so visualizing allows for monitoring of their own comprehension. It allows for, I wasn't planning on doing this right here. What are other typical comprehension strategies? My gosh, I teach this all the time, but I'm blanking. Monitor your own comprehension, which depends on visualizing. True blank. I already asked the Holy Spirit to come, so I think I'm just going to go on with what I was planning to do here. But you get the idea about visualizing. It's crucial. That is going to come up more and more today. Okay. So decoding plus comprehension, what process is that we're doing? Going from written symbols to spoken language to mental representation, picturing it? Yes, reading. So that whole thing is reading. That's input. Good reading skills depend on our ability to do these components. And the components depend on, or these connections depend on the components. So it's hard for us to listen well if we haven't taken in a lot of spoken language. It's hard for us to listen well if we haven't had many experiences of the world where we've created these mental representations. Does that make sense? So all of that initial observation that we did of the world, creating mental representations, creating spoken language representations in our mind and making all those connections, that's what allows us to understand what we listen to as we speak, as we hear it. Even if there's no picture in front of us. When kids are first learning, it's a lot easier to have a picture right there in front of them to kind of rely on to help them understand those connections between the pictures and the words. That's why young kids' books have pictures. And over time, pictures aren't needed anymore, ideally. So these components lead to these connections, and the individual, these smaller connections allow for smooth processing at this bigger level, the whole reading process. So when you hear people talk about reading from now on, what I would love